chair of Blackstone Hollow. In the hollows of the Smoky Mountains, where the trees grow so thick that the sun's light barely touches the forest floor, there's a place called Blackstone Hollow. The locals don't talk much about it, except in whispers behind closed doors, and for good reason. It was here, deep in the heart of the forest, that the legend of the evil chair was born. Long ago, before the first settlers came through the mountain passes, Blackstone Hollow was a quiet, uninhabited place, the land untouched by human hands. It was said to be sacred ground, protected by the spirits of the mountain, the wind, and the streams that ran so pure you could drink from them without worry. But that all changed the day Old Man Crane arrived. Crane wasn't like the other folk who settled along the riverbanks. He didn't come seeking land to farm or a place to raise his family. No, Crane came to the hollow seeking something else, something darker. It was said that he was a craftsman, a carpenter by trade, with a knack for working wood like none the world had ever seen. He was known to carve intricate designs into furniture, and he prided himself on creating pieces that could withstand time itself. But there was one thing Crane was truly obsessed with: making the perfect chair. He spent days wandering through the hollow, searching for the perfect wood, strong, ancient, unblemished by time. And in the deepest part of the forest, he found it, a gnarled oak that had stood for centuries, its bark as thick as the mountain itself. It was an old tree, twisted and bent, its roots buried deep in the earth, but Crane knew at once it was perfect. He saw something in it that no one else could, a strength, a mystery. And so, he took his axe and began to chop. He worked on the chair for weeks, carving and shaping the wood, his hands stained by the very tree he had taken from. As he worked, something strange began to happen. The land around him seemed to grow stiller, quieter. The birds stopped singing, the wind ceased to blow, and even the sunlight seemed to retreat from the hollow. Crane felt a strange pull as he worked, an unexplainable force that seemed to guide his hands. The chair began to take shape, perfect, flawless, yet somehow darker than any chair should be. It was as if the wood itself held something within it, something that called to him, something that wanted to be free. On the final night, as Crane finished the last intricate details of the chair's arms and legs, he felt a deep, unsettling sense of satisfaction. He looked at the chair, now complete, and it glimmered in the moonlight, though it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He sat in the chair for the first time, feeling its cold surface against his back, its solid frame beneath him. But the moment he sat, a chill ran through his spine, and a whisper echoed in his ears. "Get up, and leave?" The voice was faint, like a breath on the wind, but it was unmistakable. Crane jumped up from the chair, his heart racing. He looked around, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. The hollow was silent, the trees motionless, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. He laughed nervously, brushing the fear away. "Just the wind," he muttered to himself. "Nothing more." But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Get up, Crane. Leave, or else." Crane hesitated, but his curiosity outweighed his fear. He had put so much time, so much energy into crafting the chair, how could he leave it behind? And so, despite the eerie feeling that crawled up his neck, Crane sat back down in the chair. At once, the ground beneath him seemed to tremble, and the air grew colder still. The chair creaked, its wooden legs groaning as if it were alive. And then Crane felt it, something cold, dark, wrapping itself around his soul. A force stronger than any he had ever felt, pulling him deeper into the chair. He struggled to stand, but the chair's grip tightened, pulling him back, holding him fast. Then the earth beneath him split open, and he was sucked down into the chair, his body swallowed whole by the wood. His scream echoed through the hollow, but no one heard it. The next morning, the chair remained in the clearing, untouched. But Crane was gone, vanishing without a trace. The only thing left behind was his workshop, abandoned, the tools scattered around as if he had left in a hurry. And there, sitting in the clearing, was the chair, still gleaming darkly in the morning sun. Years passed, but the legend of the evil chair grew. No one dared go near the hollow, not after what had happened to Old Man Crane. Some said that if you sat in the chair, you would be consumed by it, pulled into the very earth from which it had been carved. Others whispered that the chair would curse you, filling your mind with madness and despair, twisting your soul until you became part of the chair itself. Despite the warnings, the chair continued to call out to anyone who ventured too close. The sound of wood creaking in the wind, the faintest whisper of a voice urging someone to sit, could be heard by those who dared to listen. And over the years, more people came to Blackstone Hollow, curious, brave, or foolish, and each one disappeared without a trace. There was the young couple, Mary and William, who thought the stories were nothing more than local superstition. They ventured into the hollow, hand in hand, laughing as they approached the chair. They sat down together, their voices light and carefree, unaware of the danger that lurked in the shadows. But when they stood to leave, they found themselves unable to move. They struggled, their faces pale with terror, but it was too late. The chair had already claimed them. The next morning, their bodies were gone, and only their footprints remained, leading straight to the chair where they disappeared into nothing. And so the years went on, with the legend growing darker with each passing decade. The stories spread through the nearby towns, and no one dared speak of the chair aloud for fear it would hear them. Children were warned never to play near the hollow, and families passed through the area with their eyes averted, as though they could outrun the curse by ignoring it. But no one ever forgot. The chair remained in Blackstone Hollow, waiting. The stranger's curse. It was a cold autumn evening when David Montgomery, a man with no belief in superstition and a heart that beat for adventure, found himself standing at the edge of Blackstone Hollow. He had heard the stories, of course, everybody in the town of Willows Creek had. But David, with his rational mind and his deep-seated curiosity, thought them nothing more than exaggerated whispers. Legends, after all, were meant to be tested, weren't they? David had arrived in Willows Creek just a few days before. He was a historian, fascinated by the untold stories of forgotten places, and Blackstone Hollow was one of the last great mysteries of the region. He'd spent his days researching the folklore at the local tavern, interviewing the townspeople, and reading whatever he could find about the legend of the evil chair. But despite all the warnings, all the fear in the eyes of the locals, David couldn't help himself. He had to see it for himself.
The night was crisp, the air thick with the scent of fallen leaves. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The trees, bare of their leaves, seemed to reach toward him with gnarled, skeletal branches, their shapes twisted in the light. The hollow was alive in its own way, not with the sounds of birds or animals, but with a stillness that made the air heavy, oppressive. David stood at the clearing, his boots crunching the dry leaves beneath him, and there, in the center, was the chair. It sat as it always had, in the same spot where Old Man Crane had carved it all those years ago. The moonlight bathed it in an ethereal glow, the dark wood gleaming with an almost unnatural sheen. It seemed to call to him, a subtle whisper in the back of his mind. He hesitated for only a moment. Just a chair, David muttered to himself. Nothing more. The legends had warned that the chair was cursed, that whoever sat in it would be consumed by the darkness it harbored. But David didn't believe in curses. He was a man of reason, and he was determined to unravel the truth behind the stories. With one final glance at the dark wood surrounding him, he took a deep breath and sat down in the chair. For a brief moment, everything seemed fine. The cold wood pressed against his back, and the stillness of the hollow wrapped around him like a blanket. But then the air changed. It grew colder, and a strange pressure settled on his chest. His breath quickened, and his heart began to pound in his ears. The whispering started, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind. But it wasn't the wind. "Leave now," the voice hissed. David's blood ran cold. He stood up quickly, but his legs felt heavy, as though the chair had rooted him to the ground. His hands trembled as he tried to push against the seat, but the pressure was unbearable. The whispers grew louder, and he felt something cold, something dark, wrap around his chest like a vice. "Get up!" he shouted, his voice frantic, but the words seemed to fade into the darkness. The chair creaked beneath him, as if it were alive, its wooden arms groaning as they held him in place. The shadows around the clearing deepened, and David could see something moving in the corner of his eye, figures, blurred and indistinct, shifting like smoke. His eyes darted around, trying to make sense of what was happening, but the world around him seemed to warp, twisting and turning like a nightmare. The whispers became clearer now, each word dripping with malice. "You will be part of us!" David's eyes widened in horror. The figures in the darkness were no longer blurred. They were people, faces he recognized from the stories. The faces of those who had disappeared, their hollow eyes staring at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. They moved closer, their footsteps silent against the forest floor, their shadows stretching long across the clearing. The coldness in the air intensified, and David felt it. Something inside him was changing, something inside him was slipping away. He reached for the chair's arms to pull himself free, but as he touched the wood, the world around him spun, and the darkness grew stronger. "No!" he screamed. "I don't believe in this. This isn't real." But the chair didn't care. The chair had claimed him. The figures, now standing just inches from him, were no longer just shadows. They were real. Their skin was pale, their eyes empty and black, their mouths twisted into expressions of agony and despair. "You should have left when you had the chance," one of the figures said, its voice hollow and distant, like a whisper from the other side. David's heart raced as he tried to push himself away from the chair, but it was too late. The darkness swirled around him, pulling him in, tugging at his soul. His vision blurred as his body grew colder, as if the chair's curse was seeping into his very being. He looked around desperately, his gaze falling on the twisted faces of the spirits that had once sat in the chair, trapped for eternity. They were waiting for him to join them. With every ounce of strength, David fought against the pull, his hands grasping the arms of the chair as he struggled to stand. But it was like trying to break free from quicksand. Each movement only made him sink deeper. He could feel the darkness closing in on him, could feel it taking hold of his mind, his soul. The chair, the curse, it was all too real. And then, just as he thought he might be lost forever, there was a sound, a crack, sharp and sudden. The chair's grip loosened, the whispers ceased, and the weight on his chest lifted. He stood up, gasping for air, his heart still racing. The figures, the shadows, vanished into the night, their presence fading like smoke in the wind. The clearing was silent again, but the air still felt heavy, as though the very land had witnessed something dark and terrible. David staggered away from the chair, his body trembling, his mind reeling. But as he turned to leave the hollow, his eyes fell on something that made his blood run cold. On the ground where he had sat, the chair sat empty, but the darkness in the woods was not gone. The trees seemed to lean closer, the whispers of the lost souls still lingering in the air. The chair waited. David didn't look back as he ran from Blackstone Hollow, his breath ragged in his chest, his mind numb with fear. He knew he had narrowly escaped. But he also knew one thing for certain: no one could ever truly leave the hollow once they had sat in the chair. The curse would follow him. It would follow anyone who dared to sit. And the chair? It would wait for the next fool to come. The curse's unending reach. David didn't return to Willow's Creek. In fact, he couldn't. The moment his feet left Blackstone Hollow, something had changed, something inside him that he couldn't explain, but he could feel it gnawing at the edges of his mind. The hollow whispers of the chair echoed in his thoughts, faint but persistent, like a distant drumbeat that wouldn't let him rest. He tried to shake it off, tried to convince himself that what had happened in the hollow was a trick of the mind, an illusion brought on by fear. But deep down, he knew better. He rented a room at a small inn in the nearby town of Ashford, hoping that the isolation would give him the peace he so desperately craved. But as the days passed, the whispers only grew louder. It wasn't just at night. It wasn't just when he closed his eyes. They followed him, persistent, a constant presence in the back of his mind. One morning, he woke to find a note on the floor beside his bed. It wasn't there when he had gone to sleep. It was just there. And it was simple, written in dark ink. "The chair waits. You are its next." David's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the note, his hand shaking as he picked it up. It wasn't possible. He had left the hollow. He had escaped, hadn't he? But there was no denying it now. The curse hadn't just followed him, it had marked him. The chair was coming for him. He had no idea how, but he knew he couldn't outrun it. He'd read about haunted places, heard about cursed objects, but this was different. This was something older, something deeper. And it wanted him. The town of Ashford, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt oppressive, suffocating. The people, who had once greeted him with smiles and curiosity, now avoided his gaze, their eyes downcast whenever he passed. It was as if the very air had changed, as though they could sense the dark presence that clung to him. He could hear the whispers when he walked through the streets, voices just barely audible, as though the town itself was warning him to leave. He tried to leave, to escape to the next town, but the whispers followed him. And the chair, he knew it was waiting. He could feel its pull, could feel the cold weight of it hanging over him. It had already claimed so many souls before him, and it would claim him too. Desperate, David returned to Blackstone Hollow. The night was darker than before, and the air was thick with mist. The wind howled through the trees, but the hollow was silent, waiting. As he walked back to the clearing, the familiar sense of dread settled over him like a shroud. The chair sat in the center, as it always had, gleaming in the pale moonlight. It was waiting for him, just as the note had said. David's feet carried him toward it, against his will. His legs felt heavy, his body unwilling, but it didn't matter. He had to sit. He had to face whatever curse this chair held. He had come back. And now, it was time. He approached the chair and sat. The moment his body touched the cold wood, the world around him shifted. The hollow seemed to disappear, replaced by a vast, dark space. The trees were gone, the stars no longer visible. He was surrounded by an impenetrable blackness, a void where nothing existed but the chair and the silence. And then, the whispers began. They were louder now, sharper, more insistent. The voices swirled around him, each one calling his name, pulling at his mind, drowning him in their despair. He tried to stand, tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was frozen, trapped in the chair, bound by its power. The darkness pressed in, suffocating him. "You came for me," a voice whispered, so close that it felt like it was inside his skull. "Now you belong to me." David's eyes widened as he tried to make sense of the words, but it was too late. The shadows in the void began to shift, twisting into shapes, into faces. The faces of the lost, the ones who had sat in the chair before him. They hovered around him, their eyes hollow and empty, their mouths twisted in silent screams. David opened his mouth to speak, to beg for mercy, but his voice was stolen. He could feel the weight of their eyes on him, could feel their anger, their hatred. They had all been claimed by the chair, trapped for eternity, and now, so was he. "You should have never sat," one of the figures hissed, its voice distorted by the darkness. "Now you are one of us. A soul bound to the chair forever." The shadows began to reach for him, their fingers long and twisted, cold as death. They surrounded him, pulling at his limbs, pulling him deeper into the chair. The more he struggled, the tighter the grip became. It was as if the chair itself was alive, feeding off his fear, his energy, his very soul. David's heart raced, and for the first time since the moment he had sat, he realized the truth. This wasn't just a curse. This was a prison, a timeless torment for those who were foolish enough to fall into its trap. He could feel himself fading, his body growing numb, his thoughts slipping away like sand through his fingers. The chair had him, and it would never let him go. He was lost to the darkness, lost to the whispers, lost to the souls that had been claimed before him. And then, just as the last of his will was consumed by the void, there was a sudden, piercing scream. It was not his own, but the scream of someone else, a woman's voice, faint but desperate. "You don't have to sit. You don't have to let it take you." David's eyes snapped open. The voice, familiar yet distant, rang in his ears, pulling him back. He tried to move, tried to escape, but the grip of the chair tightened around him, dragging him back into the darkness. But the voice came again, louder this time, stronger. "You don't have to stay. You can break the curse." The woman's voice cut through the shadows, piercing the void, and with every word, the darkness began to retreat. David could feel the grip on his soul loosening, the whispers fading, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of light. With one last surge of strength, David tore himself from the chair, ripping free from the cold, tightening grip that had held him. He stumbled back into the clearing, gasping for breath, the night air filling his lungs. And there, lying on the ground beside the chair, was the woman. She was pale, her body twisted, but her eyes were filled with a quiet strength. David staggered toward her, reaching out a trembling hand, but she was gone before he could touch her, vanishing like smoke in the wind. The chair sat silently in the clearing, the whispers gone, the air thick with an uneasy silence. David was free, for now. But as he looked back at the chair, he knew one thing for certain: the curse would never truly end. The chair would always wait, and one day, it would call again. And when it did, there would always be someone foolish enough to sit,